Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. Good to be with you again. And I'm extremely excited today to be joined by the Leader of the Opposition in Parliament, DA Leader Mmusi Maimane. Baba, thanks so much for joining us.
No, thank you. And it's great to be here in a season where Liverpool are still on top of the table.
I mean, I didn't want to bring it up, but top of the league.
Yeah. I want to do it.
The numbers don't lie.
Exactly. Everything else can change, but numbers remain the same.
Well, you did predict we'd win the Champions League. We won the Champions League. So any predictions for this season?
This is the season. Liverpool at the top of the table.
Well, either we'll be a meme or we'll be right. So
right.
We'll see what happens. By the way, I don't know if you know your new nickname after the letters in Parliament. Babes was Nwati.
Wow. Wow.
I was asking if on Thursday, I know you bring this debate to Parliament, will there be any letters
yes,
to be produced?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think South Africans are writing in general because they know life is tough. And we try and as much as we can realize that, we can talk GDP numbers, we can talk Gini coefficiency numbers, we can talk macroeconomic talk, but at the end of the day, there is a story behind someone. There is a mother tonight who will go to bed hungry and have to look after kids. There is a student who will finish university and not be able to find a job, or there is a kid who will drop out of school. So these are faces, these are South Africans. So for me, I'm always very deliberate about saying in our work, the greatest danger we can face is to be cynical. And cynicism says you forget that you are actually dealing with human lives and you are genuinely wanting to make an impact into society to someone.
Absolutely. I'm glad you start there because these economic debates are often abstract. And the president has been reflecting on some of the ways that just all of these ills in our country have flared up recently with the tragic injustice of Uyinene Mkhwetyana. Firstly, what are your thoughts on the president saying, we should all hang our heads in shame as he has finally reacted to, the tragic news that was made public yesterday?
Yeah. Firstly, I think we had to provoke the president into responding tells you the difficulty of the leadership vacuum that we have as a country. Secondly, I think that it's a failure to recognize how systemic violence is. When we think about gender-based violence, and I don't want to sit and claim being an expert on the subject, I can simply reflect on the fact that there is a challenge upon which, when you look at South African homes, particularly homes of black South Africans, you realize that the family has been dismantled. Effectively, as a function of our history, you are ending up with many kids growing up without fathers, without any sense of role modeling. The idea as to how do we deal with conflict in a society that broadly is very violent. We fail to reflect on the fact that many of our young girls drop out of school, and so the quality of education we give to young women in our country is actually substandard by international standards. We then discover that as an exacerbated level of poverty, that the home is a stressful place, and ultimately that when acts of violence take place, there's absolutely no justice for the victim, no prosecution. And as men, we fail the basic task of calling other men out. It starts with the conversation at the braai when somebody says something about a woman that degrades the dignity of that woman, that we fail to stand up and say, look, that's unacceptable in the society that we live in, as we would about other forms of discrimination, whether they be race, whether they be sexual orientation, whatever the case might be. So I think we've got to get back to saying, what is the leadership in society here? What are the systemic causes that we need to fix? And more seriously, when we set up a sexual violences court, we need to make sure that there's a capacity so that the monsters who are beating up women, who are killing people in our own homes, end up in jail. So long as that never happens, we're going to have this cycle repeat itself. And so the president, I'd rather him come out and actually announce a plan that says, how do we deal with the cycle of violence? And he had a summit last year. He's a man for many summits, but ultimately At the end of the day, we need action, and our citizens, as a father to a young girl, I think about even my own wife. It cannot be that they would be fearful to go to a post office or fearful to walk around the streets. It is simply not the society that we want, and it requires leadership that is willing to take decisive action.
And of course, this happened in Cape Town, which is a DA-led city. We've got crazy things just happening on the Cape Flats, from military deployments and a generalized feeling of crime just in many of our cities. Are you failing to deal with the crime problem in Cape Town? What do you think can be done better so that we can avoid tragic injustices like Uyinene Mrwetyana's rape and murder?
Firstly, I think our history, if you think about 1994, when the drafters of the Constitution were deciding as to how to allocate policing, they took a stance that said that policing must remain a national competence. I think that was wrong. And I can understand why they did it, for fear of the violence that engulfed our nation at the time. But what it means over a long period of time is that A, you don't have intelligence that's closer to the ground. Resource allocation is woefully unavailable, as the Kailicha Commission proved, that there was insufficient police in communities. I'm from Dobsonville in Soweto. The international average for the allocation of police needs to be somewhere between 1 is to 250 to 350. That's the broad range. That number in Dobsonville is 1 policeman to every 1,200 citizens. So when that policeman is sitting at their desk and before them is a case of domestic violence, motor vehicle accident, murder, rape, whatever the categorization of crime is, you know that they're not going to be able to effectively police that. Now, one of the great difficulties is that when I think about the Western Cape, just over 11 billion rands is allocated to policing in the province, yet the Premier of the province has no dictate as to what happens to that finance, because it's a national competence, the same in Gauteng and any other province. So I think the long-term trajectory is that we need to bring policing closer and make it a provincial competence, and that requires that we give the right resourcing to provinces. This will also ensure that provinces with metros, because they consume, many of the citizens live in those spaces, you can merge the SEPs and JMPD, so that, or Metro Police and whatever the city is. So can you imagine if all the police in the Western Cape coupled with the Metro Police in the city and any provincial police could work together as a force, be given the equipment to be able to fight crime, would have a broader crime fighting unit, and ultimately would have the intelligence to be able to fight back and know, okay, in this street, here's who's living here, here's what's happened. Because often, citizens will tell you, we know this in that home, something is not right there. We know what's happening in that community. So how do we partner better with citizens? So I really think that devolution of the powers of police is a very important step that we need to take forward so that we can fight crime.
Sure. I mean, it does feel in many ways that the country's on flight mode.
Yeah.
We've got violence which is spreading through CBDs. Seems like every day it's a new CBD. How do you feel about what's going on around our country, and just the sense that there's a sense in which we're losing our grip in many ways, in a lot of people on just a state of stability in our country?
Absolutely, and I feared the most going to the elections. I thought to myself, when you go to an election, elections give you two things. They give you three things. One, they give you a mandate to someone. They also let you build the institutional capacity to hold that person to account. But thirdly, they give you accountability and a pressure valve. You can then say, we were unhappy with what was going on in the last number of years, therefore we demand change. And I feared back then that if nothing materially changed, post the elections, something will change. This is the change we're experiencing. It's a change upon which citizens are saying, we've waited 18 months. These reforms, what are you talking about? Nothing really is happening. We've waited, we're watching life get tough around the economy, around education outcomes, around healthcare. And now suddenly, because previously maybe we had someone to blame, we thought if we eradicate corruption, all our problems will disappear. All these problems have been coming. And when you talk about the economy, people say, no, let's talk about corruption with this person or with that person. No. We needed to be much more deliberate about the issues that are affecting citizens. So now we're living in a country now where we have a party that's run out of ideas, that has the mandate, and a leader who's trying to unite his party rather than focusing on South Africa. And the net consequence of that is that we're on flight mode rudderless. And I really believe it's high time now that we have a political reform. You see, the great difficulty is that the problems that we need require change, not just in the ballot box, but in the political infrastructure. You have a party that, one finance minister issues an economic document, another one opposes it, all of it in the same party. So citizens are looking and going, not only are we being not led, we are being misled. So what we desperately need is reform. We need to reset our politics, and I'm actually looking forward to that. The hope for our country is that we must head towards another 94 moment. We must sit back and say, look, we've gone for 25 years up to this point. It served us in this way and that way. It hasn't served out in that way and that way. Where are the changes? Imagine if we could directly elect the president. Imagine if we could change our electoral system so that it's constituency-based. Imagine now suddenly if we could create a new political realignment whereupon which parties that agree on certain things could work together and be able to execute against that plan going forward. Imagine if we could call upon all citizens, black and white. Because at this point in time, sometimes it often feels like people go to the polls to express their race rather than, in fact, their ideas or their future. What we need is a sense upon which we can call upon all citizens to say, can we work together towards this objective, regardless of who we are? And then I think we need to be future-focused. Nothing dispels the spirits of citizens than hopelessness. And I fear that's what our country is going through now.
What would you change about Parliament in those reforms? It just seems to me as though there's a structural problem with Parliament holding leaders accountable. It's actually hard to get a proper debate going. And it feels to me as though there could be a lot of reforms to the parliamentary system that could make it more agile and more effective.
Yeah, and that's the point. If you created, as the Van Slabet report to Parliament said, that we need to have 300 constituencies and 100 PR-based MPs, it would mean at the end of the day, not that that's a panacea for all problems, but it would mean when an MP goes there, they're not just voting as voting cattle with an instruction from elsewhere. It means actually they must consider real-life citizens who voted for them. And it means that suddenly accountability can be affected, because now suddenly you unshackle the view that says we just vote in unison. We can then hold people to account. But furthermore, in the operations of Parliament itself, it's quite anomalous that the president comes once a term. He literally speaks to citizens 4 times a year.
Yeah, and can basically just say whatever he likes.
And that's another thing, is that because the Speaker of Parliament is not sufficiently independent, in that they come from a party, it is in their interest to protect their own leader. If the current Speaker was to take on the president, there'd be party discipline elsewhere. So we need independence in the Speaker position, or if we form it in such a way that the Speaker then resigns their party political affiliation,
as happens in other places.
as would happen, then we could finally get a Speaker who could say, I'm guaranteed 5 years and I'm going to make sure that Parliament works. One of the worst indictments was in the Zuma case of the secret ballot. The Chief Justice, in fact, remarked on Parliament and said it had also violated its constitutional mandate, which tells you that we are beyond damaged in terms of what Parliament does. It needs proper reform. But that's what I'm saying. We need another 94 moment. We need to sit down and say, we've served up to this point. Let's bring reform.
I wanted to, since we're on Parliament now, come to Parliament. I know there's something quite interesting happening on Thursday with this economic debate. But before I come on to that, I want to take you back to November last year, where Ubabes Wezincwadi was born, and you took out that letter, and you said, I have evidence here of a 500,000 rand donation and this Andile Ramaphosa situation, which just, I mean, it may go down as the most devastating parliamentary question in this term. What was going through your mind, and when did you realize, or did you even realize, that that question would lead to all that it has led to in terms of lifting the lid on these campaign donations?
When I asked the question, I wasn't even at that point worried about campaign donation, and in many ways still not worried about campaign donation. When I asked the question at that point, you'll recall a few weeks before that, or a few months before that, we just had a commission on correctional services, on the Inspector General. Arthur Fraser was moved into some corner by this president who was promising a new dawn. And correctional services was adjudicating many contracts that go to Bosasa. And now suddenly to get a candidate who, in the model, you get connected business people who buy a leader, who then the net effect gives them back contracts through the state. When the information came to say, but this man's son is then doing business with the same company, it was already alerted the issue to say, you cannot maintain this triangle. It was not, and it was roundly condemned under the Zuma years when people used to say, Ubabaga tutuzana. And I found it strange then when it was Ubabaga andile, there was suddenly a toning down. So we must go into that discussion, because if we can get through why were these contracts issued in the first place, what were they for? And you'll remember then, it then became a question of Andile coming back saying these contracts were consulting services, which is a weird amount. And then furthermore, the president then coming out to say this was campaign financing, which when you then follow the rest of what happens, you can realize that the initial suspicion, which is about how do you maintain that contract, connected business people by senior politicians who adjudicate contracts and money, as so long as the triangle keeps working, then we can keep the facade of running the government. But in fact, it becomes a scheme. That's what it is.
Were you shocked by the way it played out after you asked the question and the storm it created?
Yeah, I think I'd initially thought that it would go into the question about Andile's role. It was the next bomb that fell was when the president said no, but it was actually for campaign financing.
Right.
Then I knew back then that there was a lot more to this issue than what meets the eye. And of course, we've had other information that indicates that actually there's more to this thing. And what we shouldn't do as a country is insist that accountability must apply to person X, but not to person Y, because whatever. If you want to exercise accountability in South Africa, you need the rule of law, not the rule of man. So more must come out of this thing. Accountability must be effected, and if the president or anybody has a question to answer for, then they must. Why is it that Vincent Smith, in the same ANC, received some donation from Bosasa, took a different stance and distanced himself and resigned or whatever, and other people in the ANC's cabinet who had become Bosasa affiliates, as it were, had not been held accountable? Why should the president be unique in that space if he also received campaign donations? So at the end of the day, this issue is about if the Guptas were to President Zuma's faction, then the Watsons must be to what President Ramaphosa's faction, instruments of corruption.
Let's stay on Parliament then, and let's look at Thursday, because there's a big debate that you have initiated on the unemployment crisis and broader questions of the economy. Why have you brought this debate? What do you think needs to be our focus as South Africans think through what Parliament will be speaking about on Thursday?
You know, our Parliament has this luxury of having, not only is it multi-party, but it's multiracial. So, and I think it's the best place where it's away from the executive, where MPs who serve in different committees can then come on and say, what is our economic recovery plan? Because it's clear, 10.2 million people unemployed is unsustainable. The majority of those being young people. There are about so many of our households that are without income in them. So that crisis will impact all the MPs that are there, all 400 of them who are there, it is a dereliction of duty that Parliament itself cannot be able to table a plan that says this is our recovery plan and this is what we'll execute across various portfolios, departments, so that we can begin to guide society in general. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Parliament is where decisions are made. This is where we decide on the budget of the nation. And so if we're going to adjudicate that we must give 57 billion rands to ESCOM, which is one of the first points I make in the economic recovery plan, that we need to make decisions about what ESCOM does. You cannot just sit around and say, oh, well, we'll just keep coming there to vote like voting cattle and give money to an entity that seems to not be able to match its own revenue with its own expenses. At the end of the day, we need a decision that says, no, we're going to cut money, but we want to ensure that independent power producers can come on board. Or we must make a decision that serves the citizens, allow cities that are able to purchase energy directly to be able to do so. Or what are we doing about labor regulation? Is our labor regulation, whilst we are correcting the abuses of the past against labor, have we swung too far that it makes it too hard for someone to enter the job space, particularly young people? Can we exempt them from certain labor legislation? What is our view on collective bargaining? When we talk about justice, what does that mean? Does that mean when we think about justice when it comes to the question of land or when it comes to the question of title, how do we build a much more inclusive economy? That must inform parliamentarians' actions, and then I really think that way we could add the leadership value to society. But if Parliament cannot apply its mind on those things and we'd rather talk about motions and this, then I think we fail citizens.
Well, let's end on this because I think the economic debate is crucial, but your economic plans have also been critiqued to the extent that, yes, it's true that the state in many ways has failed and is continuing to fail. But it's also not clear that we can completely trust the private sector with questions of transformation, with questions of economic justice. And in many ways, many of your solutions seem to rest largely on privatizing or introducing a greater role for private business to increase efficiencies. Why should South Africans trust that the corporate sector in South Africa, which has been so damaging in many ways, would make this a fairer society?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. And certainly the solution doesn't lie in saying, let's just have a state-led economic development because we can't trust. Others would argue strongly that we can't trust the current state, or that history has demonstrated that states who put themselves at the center, we've got many multiple models of this, have delivered similar outcomes when you look at the African continent. So clearly we need a reform of that. But what I would argue strongly is that this is where the role of the state is to create the regulatory framework that ensures that actually private citizens are able to comply with the objectives broadly, which is about economic inclusion, etc. But also furthermore, when we define the private sector, it isn't just a question of one particular race being dominant in that space. What I really want to do is to have private citizens who are black setting up companies that are able to compete all across, because then that way we are able to create funds that give capital, that ensure that the sector is able to deliver services, but it also in and of itself becoming much more inclusive. So I think it becomes a question of regulatory framework and a conducive climate. So when I ask the question, what are some of the objectives that we've got to try and hit, you think about issues like spectrum as an example.
Oh my goodness.
Here we sit here today. If you want to download anything onto your phone, you're going to pay a fortune.
Yeah, our subscribers who watch this on WhatsApp will be very keen to.
Yeah, so what I'm saying to them is that the solution requires that spectrum be allocated in a space where it can be more competitive, and if you bring in more competition, you'll drive prices down. But if you fail to allocate spectrum, you are going to end up in a space where, as the current framework has got now, spectrum is in some ways nationalized, you are driving costs up. And that is a classic example of what happens when you put the state at the center of the management of the infrastructure around spectrum. And I'm asking the question that we've got to rethink it. And if we can be able to do that, we can allow more people to come on board, introduce 5G, new technology, and drive down prices so that the state isn't worried about maintaining towers and infrastructure, which is not their primary competence. It must worry that there's healthcare, there's medicines in hospitals, textbooks in schools, worry that in fact it creates the regulatory framework for people to thrive. So I think no one ever, I want a market-based economy, but that's not to the exclusion of the state, because I think the state creates the conducive environment for which citizens are able to thrive.
Mr. Mmusi Maimane, thanks so much for joining us again on SMWX, and look forward to the parliamentary debate on Thursday.
No, my great privilege. Thank you.
And look forward to Liverpool winning.
You should never walk alone.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, bro.
Sure.
Great job.
Appreciate it.
I always enjoy these interviews. I find. Thank you for your question.
Thanks for watching the content. Like, share, and subscribe on all platforms. smwx.co.za to join the WhatsApp channel. And let's build a new conversation for a new generation. I hear you.